Welcome to the Reality Taboo. It's January 11th, 2025, and here in Eagleland, in the middle of America, we are digging ourselves out of one of the worst blizzards that the middle of the United States has experienced in several years, if not decades. And almost contemporaneous to that are historic wildfires in California that have burnt at this point in time over 50 square miles in total, and the largest fires are still far from being contained, and invariably come the assertions that that is, at least in some part, a consequence of catastrophic anthropogenic global warming, or CAGWA for short. And the asymmetry of information surrounding the issue is something that sticks in my craw. I took some time to look at recorded historical high temperatures in randomly selected metro areas. There are sites that will show these data points going back to around 1900, which is give or take the time when most modern temperature record keeping began. If you imagine your metro area's nightly newscast and the weatherman comes on and he gives you the high and low for the day and where that compares to the historical high and low, you can pull up that information. Currentresults.com is the site that I used, and I just randomly checked Buffalo, New York first, and then I looked at Atlanta, and then I looked at Des Moines, just to take three randomly, where there were temperature records going from 1900 to 2024, and the high temperature in Buffalo was recorded over that period of time, so a century and a quarter, about 125 years. The highest temperature was recorded in Buffalo in 1948. In Atlanta, it was in 2012, and in Des Moines, it was 1983. And the federal government maintains a website, weather.gov, that shows in which year the record temperature for each month of the year was reached. I pulled up Dallas, Texas, and going from January through December, those 12 months, from this one goes back to 1899, a year before. From 1899 to 2024, the highest temperature in January through December is what I'll go through. So in January, it was reached in 1911, in February in 1904, in March in 1916, in April in 2006, in May in 1927, in June in 1980, in July in 1998, in August in 1936, in September in the year 2000, in October 1951, in November 2017, and in December 1951. So I am aware of my own bias. The parameters that I operate on by default is that there really is nothing more synonymous with human material flourishing than access to cheap, reliable, consistent energy. And so my orientation towards these questions is one of incredulity and a high level of skepticism. But I also tried to be empirically informed. And if there was catastrophic warming occurring, I would suspect that I would be able to see evidence of it right in front of my nose. And I spend a lot of time outside. I travel several hundred miles a month on bike, and so I'm quite cognizant of the temperature and the fluctuations in temperature and the wind direction and how that affects temperature. I feel like I'm pretty plugged in an organic sense to that, and I haven't experienced that any noticeable increase in heat over the duration of my own lifetime. And I can see how this could be caricatured as a rube, just saying, well, I don't see it on my front porch, so it must not be happening. And that's fair enough, and I suppose I could accept that as an argument for why there could be incremental changes in the global average temperature, whatever exactly that means, the global average temperature over time. But the idea that that is bad for me, bad for humans in general, let alone catastrophic, is something that I would expect that I would be able to at least notice it happening in front of me if it was really as bad as it's often made out to be. And there's a big expert class problem here. The asymmetry of information allows the expert class to utilize intentionally arcane data that is not accessible to the general public, rather than looking at local temperature records, which are widely available and easily accessible by the public. And those, as we looked at here with a couple random examples, and I would encourage anyone to go to currentresults.com or weather.gov to look at temperatures in the area that they live or just random places that come to mind and check them over time. And if you see a clearly defined pattern in which more later years show consistently higher temperatures, I'd be interested in seeing that. And I'm sure there are certain metro areas where you could find that if you were going to cherry pick the data for it. And correspondingly, you could find probably the exact opposite, where there are places where the highest temperatures were all recorded in the early 1900s and there hasn't been any new highs made in the last century. And I don't know that that is any more dispositive one way or the other, but I would expect if the heating is catastrophic that there would be a consistent and easily viewable pattern that would manifest in these numbers, and they just don't. But before I throw even more rhetorical skepticism against CAGWA, I'm going to let Jeff respond to any of this if he has anything to say in response.
The big caveat that I'm well outside my depth in terms of knowledge of climate science, but my understanding is that global temperatures have risen. Obviously, you can pick particular metro areas that defy this trend of general warming, but there's, I would think, just as many, if not more, metro areas that have had all of their hottest years in the last 10, 15, 20 years. And global temperatures, if you can trust the available data, seem to have increased substantially. And substantially is used advisedly. Substantially in the context of climate can be a degree or two, which can make a huge difference. And again, if you believe the data, the mainstream data on climate science, a 1% increase in global temperature has huge effects.
I think you have to put some pressure on what huge effects mean. What does that mean in terms of how it manifests in actual human society? Do we measure it, say, by the number of climate-related deaths that have occurred? Because if we look at those at a per capita basis, they have dropped precipitously over the last several centuries, and they are the lowest ever recorded in human history. Now, the number of people who die in droughts and floods and other sorts of natural disasters. In the 1920s, the per capita death rate per 100,000 people was 26, and in the 2020s, that figure is much less than 1%. It's a fraction of 1, and so it has dropped by a factor of about 50 times over the last century, where people were about 50 times as likely to die in, and here are the different categories that they use for the data that we're looking at here, in droughts, floods, earthquakes, storms, extreme temperatures, volcanoes, wildfires, glacial lake outbursts, mass movements that are dry, mass movements that are wet, and fog. And this alludes to a broader point that I suspect I'll return to multiple times through the duration of this discussion, and that is, even if there is some marginal, and again, I don't think it's catastrophic, that's part of what I want to try to wrestle with here at this discussion. It doesn't seem at all catastrophic, even if there is some marginal increase in risk because the global average temperatures are getting slightly hotter on the order of maybe 1 or 2 degrees over a period of 100 years. We're talking multiple generations. That even if there is some marginal increase in problems that causes, that it is far outstripped by the ability to mitigate those problems that are brought about by technological progress, and that technological progress is undergirded significantly, more so than by any other factor, by the accessibility of cheap, reliable, consistent energy production. And that so often the green movements in the modern world are they particularly take aim at trying to make that energy production as unreliable and as expensive and as inconsistent as possible. My litmus test here is nuclear power generation, because nuclear power is the most reliable, consistent, efficient form of energy production that humanity has ever discovered. And so if someone asserts that CAGWA is a meaningful concern, perhaps the most important concern facing humanity, and yet that same person has an opposition to nuclear power generation, I find it extremely difficult to take them seriously. I think there is an ulterior motive, and I don't think that what they are saying, that they are arguing in good faith. I interpret it instead as a kind of misanthropy and Luddite orientation towards the world, disguising itself as a concern for the environment, for some sort of green Gaia worship.
It's important to differentiate a few things. So you could believe, as I do, that global temperatures are rising in large part due to human activity, specifically the burning of fossil fuels, and also believe that that is causing significant harmful effects in the form of natural disasters, higher temperatures, rising sea levels. But you could believe all that, but also believe that the trade-off is worth it, that despite those costs of fossil fuels, the benefits of fossil fuels outweigh those negatives. And I think sometimes the right wing takes a reactive approach to where they essentially see the left make claims about climate change and they just say the opposite. And so they resort to this sort of crude, ugly mass consumption where they'll talk about how they get a gas guzzler just for the sake of it. And
There might be a bit of a caricature. I don't know how many people you've come across who have celebrated the fact that they guzzle a bunch of gas. Like, oh yeah, burned a bunch of gasoline that I didn't need to burn. Now, I think your criticism could be directed at someone who says, for example, takes pride in driving an F-350 because he likes it and he likes the power and he doesn't mind the fact that it consumes a lot of gasoline for what it does, for the power that it gives and the size that it provides. But I think that guy is really small potatoes compared to all of the avowed or supposedly avowed climate activists who ride in private jets, crisscross the globe. The globe-trotting set are the ones who voice the most concern about environmental degradation through the consumption of fossil fuels, and yet flying it, like Bill Gates flying his private jet across the ocean one time, is going to put more emissions through carbon fuel consumption than that guy and 1,000 guys like him driving an F-350 150,000 miles until it doesn't run any longer.
I take your point, Ness. I think that's a better description of the dynamic. And far worse are people like Leonardo DiCaprio, a actor and supposed environmental activist who was, according to ChatGPT, flew 8,000 miles via private jet from New York to Europe to accept an environmental award, then returned to Europe for a charity event, and in 2014 took a 6 round-trip private jet flights between California and New York over 6 weeks. And then as recently as last year, in February 2024, he was criticized for traveling nearly 20,000 kilometers, primarily via private jet, to attend parties in cities like Milan, London, Paris, and Los Angeles. And so I wonder, people like DiCaprio, do they believe anything that they're saying? Do they believe what they're saying, but then they just are too selfish and they care way more about their own personal convenience and gratification than they do about this? Or is it just that they don't believe any of it and it's purely a status thing? What do you think, Ness?
I think it is predominantly one of status consideration. You'll notice that, at least according to ChatGPT, the first time that he took the commercial public flights probably not in coach, probably not in row 28, the middle seat. He was probably in first class, but he took some relatively high profile commercial flights to Scotland to attend this climate change conference. Well, that was recent, and that was in response to the negative status that he was accruing on account of being viewed as a hypocrite for flying privately. It wasn't like he had some Damascus conversion in his own solitude while he was pondering, like contemplating what he could do in his life to reduce his own impact on the climate. Instead, he flew private jets back and forth, one flight across the Atlantic, again, spewing more carbon into the atmosphere than any number of those, tens, hundreds of F-350 drivers that I gave Jeff a little ribbing for caricaturing as reveling in their own gas consumption. Somebody like Leonardo DiCaprio has done far more to pollute the earth than those yahoos could ever dream of doing. And they wouldn't be dreaming of doing it one way or the other because it's just not something that they think about. I don't think anybody, again, actively thinks, man, I really want to destroy Mother Nature by burning a bunch of fuel that I don't need to otherwise burn. To be charitable, there are some number of dogs that don't bark out there, people who really are concerned about reducing their own carbon footprints and want to see reductions in fossil fuel consumption occur, and so they do it in their own ways, in their own private lives, but those people are not going to be the ones who make a big public show of it, or at least that could be the case, but it is impossible not to notice the tendency for the people who tend to be the loudest vocal critics of fossil fuel consumption being those who consume the most fossil fuel per capita in the world today, and on the scale, on the entire scale of human history, per capita energy consumption at rates unseen and utterly unmatched in all of human history. These people consume more energy per capita than any humans ever at any point in human history, and they tend to be the ones who are the most vocal critics of energy consumption by humans. Although it is also worth noting that we hear a lot about reducing automobile travel, far less about reducing air travel, even though per capita, of course, air travel emits far more carbon than automobile travel. But the people who would be inconvenienced by a reduction in air travel are not the same people who would suffer nearly as much with restrictions on automobile travel. I find that the dynamic that often plays out is that those who are concerned have environmental concerns, they want other people outside of their own social class to sacrifice for the good of the earth, but they are far less willing to do so in their own personal lives. I did want to swing back to something you said earlier about heat in a litany of things that were presumably or insinuated to be negative. I would push back on that strongly. I think generally heat is good for humans and cold is bad for humans. Cold kills far more people each year and has throughout human history than warmth has. Humans are much better suited to survive in tropical climates than they are in Arctic climates. And so it's not at all obvious to me why a increase in global temperatures on its own, at least in isolation, would be a negative for humanity. If anything, I would think that it would be generally a positive. Something like 25% of the world's oil reserves are trapped underneath ice now in the Arctic regions. And there is a vast amount of virgin wilderness in places like Canada and Siberia that would be accessible for human agricultural development. And so in terms of resources and food production, the things that the pyramid the base of the pyramid in what constitutes human flourishing, those sorts of things would be augmented by increases in global temperatures. I think it's a fair characterization to say that you would self-describe yourself as environmentalist or environmentally conscious. So I pose the question of why, because you also self-describe as an atheist. And so is there a non-utility reason to respect nature? Or is it just a concern that a disregard for the potential global consequences of unnecessary energy consumption will actually harm humanity and make life worse for people, not necessarily for the earth as some independent entity that deserves our respect beyond its ability to pay us back? I'm interested in how you look at your relationship with the earth. I have to say my orientation is more one that is partial to that of C. Montgomery Burns.
Oh, so Mother Nature needs a favor. Well, maybe she should have thought of that when she was besetting us with droughts and floods and poison monkeys. Nature started the fight for survival, and now she wants to quit because she's losing. Well, I say hard cheese.
Well, I don't have a great answer. As an atheist, I certainly struggle with nihilism and the idea that nothing really matters, and that can be something that's a struggle that I don't have a good answer to. It can also oddly be comforting in the sense that if I worry about, it helps me if I get worked up about things. I think, well, it's not going to make any difference in the end. We're all going to the same place. There's no heaven or hell, so don't get too worked up about it. It's not going to matter in the end. But as far as the environmental issue, I guess just I've seen a lot of natural beauty in my life, and there's not a lot of things that create a sense of awe in me, and I just feel a desire. I can't really say where it comes from to preserve that, to protect it, and I just get an instinctive disgust when I see it so casually disregarded or treated as just something that's purely there for exploitation. And then, of course, there is a utilitarian aspect to it, to where it's just a matter of preserving it for myself and my family and people I care about, and I want it to be around for future generations to enjoy it, the natural beauty of the world, like I got to.
I'm sure that is a genuinely held sentiment. I think it is also one, though, that tends to be echoed more by people who live in more populated, more developed places that have less regular contact with the natural world. Certainly that's how it maps politically. The people who are the greenest in their political outlooks tend to be people who live in urban areas and places with high levels of conurbation, and the people who are least concerned about green political priorities are people who live in rural areas, who contend with nature at a far more visceral and day-to-day struggle level. And so they may have some respect for nature, but they don't necessarily have an inherent reverence for it. And for someone who is atheist, your paean to the natural world sounds like it comes dangerously close to being sort of religiously motivated. I think there are real world practical problems with implementation of green policy priorities. You can look at Los Angeles now. Controlled burns are necessary because fire is a crucial part of the arboreal ecosystem, and Mother Nature has fires. And in many places in the country, living here in flyover country, I see it on a drive of a couple hours with my kids. Last week, we noticed 3 different brush fires, controlled brush fires, that were occurring as a tool to get rid of the underbrush to reduce the risk of conflagrations like the ones that are consuming Southern California now. And there are lots of regulations in California that preclude these sorts of regular controlled burns to occur, so that it ends up in a situation where it's like a tinderbox and it just takes a match to strike it and the whole thing goes up in flames. And it's usually the justification will be to protect this or that bird or fish. And so whatever the intentions are aside, a lot of those animals that are allegedly being protected by these restrictions were just incinerated over the last week in massive numbers across several square miles. So practically the worst approach of all is to preclude the burning from occurring at all. And I think it parallels in some way the neoliberal technocratic approach to everything that we are settling under that oppressive cloud of, like pharmaceuticals, the idea of reducing the immediate risk to zero so we can stave off the problem for now, but in the future it portends disaster. That immediate problem, a brush fire or a broken arm, those things are manageable. The longer-term catastrophic problems, hundreds of thousands of acres being burnt to a crisp in a wildfire that's burning out of control, or say diabetes, those are much worse in the scheme of things, but they come further down the road by neglecting the things that need to be done now, but that are somewhat uncomfortable, somewhat unpleasant. The same pattern exists in the world of finance. We cut costs and we make acquisitions, outsource, skimp on quality assurance in an effort to make quarterly numbers at the expense of long-term financial viability and sustainability. In all three cases, the emphasis is on the immediate at the expense of the future. We are living in a high time preference, high status conscious society.
As cynical as I am, I have a hard time accepting or believing that the people who put the current fire policies in place in the state of California and specifically Los Angeles County, I just have a hard time believing that they knew that the policies they put into place would result in fires like we're seeing now in January 2025, but they put them in place anyway because they thought saving some animals was more important, or they just thought it was more politically expedient. And then the answer that, well, it's not those same people, it's not the elites who pay the price. I think in this case it actually is, because the people who are, at least at first, I don't know, as the fires moved, I think they're moving into more working class areas in general, but like the Palisades area is home to some of the wealthiest Hollywood elites, the wealthiest people in the country, and those are the people whose houses are being destroyed. So I just don't understand why they would allow a policy like this to go into place if they knew it would result in what we're seeing now. Another aspect that makes these fires so horrific is all of the petroleum products that are used to build houses, and all the products within the houses and the power lines and all the man-made environment. That fire burning through woods and trees and brush is one thing, but fire burning through petroleum products is another thing.
I don't think the out-of-control forest fires are an intended outcome. I think it is more a consequence, again, of status signaling and status obsession, paired with a haughtiness that is hard for people of more middling status to understand. I think they probably never expose themselves to the boring ideas, mundane ideas about basic forest management practices. I don't think that is on the radar of a lot of the political class in the Western world at all. It's being reported now that in the Palisades that the fire hydrants are literally out of water. And the mayor of the city is in another hemisphere on the other side of the world, in Africa. The black mayor is in Ghana while Gomorrah burns. I think it is more a question of, again, status signaling and the acquisition of political power, paired to some extent with bureaucratic incompetence, ineptitude. It's worth noting, too, that these wildfires that periodically crop up, not to this extent, this one is an outlier, but they tend to almost exclusively occur in the western part of the United States, where there is far more federally managed, federally owned land than there is, say, east of the Mississippi, where there's virtually none. And there's plenty of forested and wooded areas in New York and in Tennessee and in Missouri, but the wildfires that burn out of control never seem to occur in those states. And as far as the question of it hitting this close to home and how that is indicative of they're not intending for this to happen, there could be a real silver lining here because, of course, if the oceans are rising, all of that Malibu beachfront property is going to become submerged anyway. And so this is just going to get them out of there before the deluge submerges them.
Before we wrap up, I wanted to follow up on something Ness said earlier. He mentioned how supposed environmentalists who refuse to entertain any talk of nuclear energy, in the same way he can't take them seriously. I can't take seriously people who talk about how important environmentalism is, but then support mass immigration. And the United States is the largest per capita emitter of greenhouse gases. So it's very obvious that the more people you allow into the country that emits the highest per capita greenhouse gases, the worse the climate crisis is going to get. And yet these people seem to have no interest in stopping the flood of illegal immigration and legal immigration into the United States. And that is something, obviously, that comes up a lot here at The Reality Taboo, the topic of immigration. And there's going to be a lot to talk about there, or cynically maybe not so much to talk about, depending on how the Trump administration goes. But we're about 10 days out from Donald Trump returning to the office, and there's a lot of talk about immigration and mass deportations, and we'll just have to wait and see what really happens. But just a little teaser, the House did just pass the Lake and Riley Act, and it looks like the Senate is going to, it's past the procedural threshold where it's actually going to be debated/voted on. One other thing before, sorry, I forgot to mention this before we close out. On the note of, in my opinion, environmentalism and concern about immigration go hand in hand, in the sense that if you care about preserving the natural beauty that we are blessed with in the United States and preserving it and taking care of it as much as possible, it seems to me you would want to limit the number of people coming into the United States, especially people who are coming from countries that don't have much regard for preserving the environment. That sentiment is expressed, or is described by how the Sierra Club reacted. The Sierra Club used to, for most of its existence, was just as I described. They saw their mission as preserving the natural beauty, and as obvious result of that, they expressed concerns about population growth, including immigration, as contributing to environmental pressures like resource depletion, habitat destruction. And in the 1980s and 90s, the Sierra Club actually supported reducing immigration levels. And then something happened. By the early 2000s, they had completely reversed course and no longer talked about reducing immigration levels.
That something that happened was something that Videra wrote many posts and articles about. It was a major mega donor to the Sierra Club that donated, I believe, 8 figures. I'd have to look at it, an 8-figure amount contingent upon the Sierra Club dropping its opposition to immigration and becoming neutral on the political questions surrounding immigration in the United States as a policy concern. And it is, of course, worth noting that one of the arguments for the necessity, the urgency to tackle climate change, catastrophic climate change, is that it will disproportionately create bad conditions in the developing world. And so as a means of saving the third world and the developing world from the climate catastrophe that is coming, we must allow them to come into Western countries. The phrase climate refugee is a real term. It's a real category that the UN, among other organizations, measures. And so even though they will burn more carbon fuel here in the United States than they would in most of their home countries, for the sake of the climate, we are still compelled to allow them to come here. That this is logically inconsistent doesn't matter. because they're not arguing in good faith. At least that's how I see it. And I'll close us off on one quick nitpick. According to the emissions database for global atmospheric research, known by the acronym EDGAR, which is something that the IPCC utilizes and treats as one of the gold standards. According to it, the United States is not the top emitter in carbon emissions per capita in the world. It actually comes in at 16th. There are 15 countries ahead of them. Most of them are small Middle Eastern countries like Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, but Canada, Russia, and Australia also come in ahead of the United States. The thrust of Jeff's point, of course, still stands. I'm not meaning to undercut that. That's out of 208 measured countries, so the United States is still in the top 10%, but it is not the global leader in emissions. That'll do it for us today. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.